Ozuki Airfield, Northern Kyushu, Japan. November 24, 1944, 22:30 hours. Major Isamu Kashide of the Fourth Air Regiment stood in the winter darkness, watching his breath crystallize in the frozen air as the first alerts crackled through the base communications system. American bombers approaching from the south. Altitude unknown. Course steady toward Tokyo. The mathematics of interception scrolled through his mind with the cold precision of a man who had spent 18 months preparing for this exact moment. His Kawasaki Ki 45 Toryu fighters could reach 20,000 feet in approximately 7 minutes under combat load. The new American B-29 Superfortress bombers, according to every intelligence estimate produced by Imperial General Headquarters since August, operated routinely above 30,000 feet. Kashide understood what his superiors in Tokyo refused to acknowledge. The ceiling problem was not theoretical, it was absolute. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 6 months earlier, on June 15, 1944, the Fourth Air Regiment had achieved Japan's first successful interception of a B-29 during the Yawata raid. One confirmed kill against 47 bombers that reached the target. The victory had been celebrated in Tokyo. The tactical reports, filed by Kashide himself, had been quietly buried. Those reports contained a truth that Japanese military doctrine could not accommodate. The Kawasaki Ki 45 Toryu could reach the B-29s. Barely. The aircraft could climb to 33,000 feet under optimal conditions with minimal fuel load and no ammunition weight. But reaching altitude and maintaining combat effectiveness at altitude represented entirely different operational realities. The temperature at 30,000 feet above northern Kyushu averaged -40 degrees Fahrenheit. The oxygen density was 30% of sea level concentration. The Nakajima Ha-25 engines that powered the Toryu fighters lost approximately 40% of their rated horsepower above 25,000 feet. Most critically, the aircraft's maximum speed at 30,000 feet degraded to approximately 280 miles per hour. The B-29 Superfortress cruised at that altitude at 340 miles per hour while carrying 10 tons of bombs. Lieutenant General Torashiro Kawabe, commander of the Army Air Force, had received Kashide's post-action analysis in July. The document had outlined with methodical precision why conventional interception tactics would fail against American strategic bombers operating at their designed cruising altitude. The physics were immutable. Japanese fighters required 6 to 7 minutes to climb from ground level to 20,000 feet. During that climb, traveling at best climb speed of approximately 180 miles per hour, the aircraft consumed enormous fuel reserves, while the pilot endured increasing oxygen deprivation and temperature extremes that degraded combat effectiveness with every 1,000 feet of altitude gained. Meanwhile, B-29 formations approaching at 31,000 feet and traveling at 340 miles per hour covered 57 miles during those same 7 minutes. Even if early warning systems provided perfect tracking data and fighters launched exactly when bombers appeared on coastal radar stations, the mathematical intersection of climb rate, fuel consumption, and target velocity created an interception window measured in seconds rather than minutes, and that calculation assumed the American bombers maintained steady course and speed. If they executed even modest evasive maneuvers or shallow dives to accelerate, Japanese fighters struggling at their performance, ceiling had zero capability to adjust. The fundamental flaw in Japanese air defense doctrine had become apparent during the first Marianas-based B-29 raids in late November. Imperial General Headquarters had designed defensive systems, assuming enemy bombers would approach Japanese cities at altitudes between 15,000 and 23,000 feet. That assumption drew from extensive combat experience against American B-17 and B-24 bombers operating over the Pacific since 1942. Those aircraft typically attacked from 18,000 to 22,000 feet, altitudes where Japanese fighters performed well and where interception tactics developed through 3 years of combat had proven effective. The B-29 Superfortress had rendered that entire operational framework obsolete overnight. Colonel Saburo Endo, chief intelligence officer for the 6th Air Army defending Tokyo, had recognized the problem by August 1944. His analysis, submitted to Army General Staff Headquarters, documented with brutal clarity why Japan's fighter inventory could not effectively counter the American strategic bombing threat. Of the approximately 4,500 aircraft assigned to Homeland Defense in late 1944, fewer than 300 possessed the performance characteristics necessary to intercept bombers at 30,000 feet. The Kawasaki Ki 45 Toryu could reach that altitude, but lacked the speed and armament to engage effectively. The Kawasaki Ki 61 Haiyan demonstrated better performance between 25,000 and 30,000 feet, but required nearly 8 minutes to climb from sea level, by which time American bombers had typically completed their bombing runs and begun their return flight. The Nakajima Ki 84 Hayate, Japan's newest and most capable fighter, could theoretically intercept B-29s at altitude. The aircraft reached 35,000 feet under test conditions and maintained a maximum speed of 392 miles per hour at optimal altitude. But production delays and chronic engine reliability problems meant fewer than 150 Ki 84s were operational by November 1944. More critically, those few operational aircraft were scattered across defensive zones from Kyushu to northern Honshu, responding to threats across thousands of square miles of Japanese airspace. Concentrating Ki 84s for massed defensive operations would leave vast regions undefended, a strategic vulnerability Japanese commanders considered unacceptable. Endo's intelligence assessment had concluded that Japan needed approximately 800 high-altitude interceptors, equipped with radar, oxygen systems capable of sustained operations above 30,000 feet, and armament heavy enough to bring down B-29s through defensive fire that American crew training emphasized as formidable. The document estimated that developing, producing, and deploying such an aircraft force would require minimum 18 months under optimal conditions. With American submarine warfare strangling raw material imports and precision bombing targeting aircraft production facilities, optimal conditions no longer existed. The response from Army General Staff had arrived in September. Endo was reassigned to Manchuria. His assessment was classified as defeatist speculation unsuitable for distribution. The official position remained that Japanese fighters, through superior tactics and pilot determination, could counter American strategic bombing through conventional interception methods proven effective earlier in the war. Major Kashide had read Endo's classified report before its author disappeared into the Manchurian command structure. The analysis had confirmed what every experienced fighter pilot defending the homeland understood but could not publicly acknowledge. The altitude, ceiling problem was not a temporary technical challenge that improved tactics or pilot training could overcome. It represented a fundamental mismatch between Japanese defensive capabilities and American offensive systems, specifically designed to exploit that exact vulnerability. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress had entered development in 1938, with explicit requirements for operations above 30,000 feet. American designers understood that altitude provided protection superior to armor or defensive armament. Thin air at 30,000 feet degraded fighter performance, anti-aircraft effectiveness, and pilot combat capability, while favoring the pressurized, turbocharged systems that the B-29 incorporated throughout its design. The entire aircraft existed to operate in an environment where conventional defenses failed. Japanese aircraft development had followed different priorities. The legendary maneuverability of the Mitsubishi A6M0 derived from minimal weight and maximum wing area. That design philosophy produced fighters that dominated at low to medium altitudes, where dogfighting advantage belonged to the most agile aircraft. The Zero's 950 horsepower Nakajima Sakai engine provided excellent performance below 15,000 feet. Above 25,000 feet, the aircraft became increasingly sluggish as thin air robbed power and control authority. The engineering trade-offs that made the Zero brilliant at 10,000 feet rendered it nearly useless at 30,000. Subsequent Japanese fighter designs had attempted to address high-altitude limitations while maintaining the dogfighting characteristics Japanese tactical doctrine emphasized. The Kawasaki Ki 61 Hien incorporated a licensed Daimler-Benz liquid-cooled inline engine specifically because its turbocharger promised better high-altitude performance than traditional radial engines. The aircraft reached 31,000 feet and maintained reasonable speed at altitude. But the German engine proved catastrophically unreliable in Japanese production facilities, lacking precision tooling and quality metallurgy. Maintenance requirements consumed 3 times the man-hours of radial engine fighters. Spare parts availability created operational nightmares. By late 1944, fewer than 40% of Ki 61 aircraft remained mission-capable at any given time, despite desperate maintenance efforts. The fundamental problem transcended individual aircraft performance. Japanese aviation industry had developed within resource constraints that made the lavish American approach to engine development impossible. Wright Aeronautical Corporation had invested more than $100 million developing the R-3350 duplex Cyclone engine that powered the B-29. That single engine program cost more than Japan's entire annual aircraft development budget. The R-3350 produced 2,200 horsepower reliably at 30,000 feet through exotic metallurgy, precision superchargers, and fuel injection systems that demanded manufacturing capabilities Japan simply did not possess. Lieutenant Colonel Takeo Doi, chief engineer at Kawasaki's Akashi plant, had studied captured American engines with growing desperation throughout 1944. The technical specifications read like science fiction compared to Japanese capabilities. Magnesium cylinder heads that dissipated heat while reducing weight, sophisticated anti-knock fuel additives that allowed compression ratios Japanese engines could never achieve, electronic ignition systems that provided reliable spark at extreme altitudes where conventional magnetos failed, manufacturing tolerances measured in 10,000ths of an inch where Japanese production standards worked in thousandths. The Americans had not simply built better engines, they had developed entire industrial ecosystems specifically to support high-altitude aviation that Japan lacked the resources to replicate even if given unlimited time. On November 24, 1944, Major Kashide's technical understanding collided with military reality as 111 B-29s appeared on radar tracking displays approaching Tokyo from the south. The primary target was the Nakajima Musashino aircraft engine plant on Tokyo's outskirts. The facility produced the Ha-45 Homare engines that powered Japan's newest fighters. American intelligence had correctly identified the plant as a critical bottleneck in Japanese fighter production. Destroying it would cascade through defensive capabilities for months afterward. The Fourth Air Regiment scrambled 28 Ki-45 Toryu fighters at 22:45 hours. The 67th and 74th Air Regiments launched an additional 40 aircraft, mostly Ki-61 Hien and Ki-44 Shoki fighters, theoretically capable of high-altitude interception. Weather conditions were unusually favorable. Clear skies, minimal wind, excellent visibility. Radar tracking provided continuous updates on American bomber formations, maintaining steady course toward their target. Every advantage Japanese air defense doctrine assumed necessary for successful interception existed that night. The B-29s cruised at 31,000 feet. Japanese fighters struggled upward through freezing air, pilots enduring oxygen starvation and temperature extremes while watching their fuel gauges drop with alarming speed. The Ki-45 units reached 28,000 feet after 11 minutes of maximum climb, still 3,000 feet below the American bombers, still traveling 120 miles per hour slower. The Ki-61s achieved slightly better altitude but faced identical speed differential. American formations overflew their intercept positions and proceeded directly to the target area, while Japanese fighters desperately attempted to gain additional altitude and overtake speed. 3 fighters achieved firing positions during the entire action. 2 Ki-61 pilots managed head-on passes against bomber formations, expending all ammunition in 10-second bursts that produced no confirmed hits before American defensive fire drove them off. 1 Ki-84 pilot, Lieutenant Isamu Sasaki of the 47th Sentai, successfully closed to effective range and maintained position long enough to damage a B-29's No. 3 engine with 30mm cannon fire. His aircraft was immediately engaged by defensive gunners from 3 surrounding bombers. 23 7.62 mm rounds struck his aircraft. He ditched successfully in Tokyo Bay. The bomber completed its mission and returned to Saipan. 100 American aircraft bombed the target area. Actual damage to the Nakajima plant was minimal. High-altitude bombing accuracy proved worse than expected due to the jet stream phenomenon American crews had not yet learned to compensate for. But tactical success was irrelevant to the strategic revelation that night had delivered to Japanese commanders. For 3 hours, Japanese fighters had pursued American bombers across 200 miles of defended airspace. The entire defensive system had functioned exactly as designed. Radar detected the approaching raid with 90 minutes advance warning. Fighter units scrambled promptly and achieved excellent climb rates. Pilots demonstrated exceptional courage attempting intercepts under conditions that would kill through oxygen starvation or temperature exposure before combat damage. The coordination between ground control, radar tracking, and fighter units represented the culmination of years of defensive doctrine development, and they had achieved effectively nothing against bombers operating at their designed cruising altitude. The November 24th raid demonstrated what subsequent months would confirm with devastating repetition. The B-29 Superfortress could operate over Japan with near impunity when flown at 30,000 feet. Japanese fighters theoretically capable of reaching that altitude lacked the performance margin to intercept effectively. Even when successful intercepts occurred, defensive firepower from the B-29's remote-controlled turrets created kill zones that Japanese fighters could not penetrate without suffering unacceptable casualties. The psychological impact on Japanese fighter pilots exceeded the tactical failure. Pilots who had dominated Pacific combat for 3 years found themselves reduced to frustrated spectators, watching enemy bombers destroy their homeland while flying just beyond effective engagement range. The crushing futility of pursuing targets you could see but could not catch, of climbing until oxygen deprivation blurred vision and hypothermia numbed hands, and of watching fuel gauges approach zero while American formations proceeded unmolested to their targets, created psychological damage that no amount of rhetoric about Yamato spirit could repair. Major Kashide filed his after-action report on November 26th. The document avoided defeatist language while documenting with clinical precision why conventional interception had failed. Altitude differential, speed advantage, fuel limitations, defensive armament superiority. Each factor analyzed independently before the synthesis revealed the fundamental problem. Japanese fighters were not fighting American bombers at 30,000 feet. They were attempting to fight physics itself, and physics was undefeated. The report concluded with recommendations that Kashide knew would be ignored. Concentrate all Ki-84 Hayate fighters into dedicated high-altitude interception units. Abandon attempts to intercept at cruise altitude, and instead focus on catching bombers during their descent to bombing altitude when speed differentials decreased. Develop ramming tactics using pilots who had already accepted that intercepting B-29s at altitude was effectively suicide, and simply formalize that reality into doctrine. Most critically, acknowledge that defending against B-29s required aircraft and capabilities Japan could not produce within timelines that mattered strategically. General Kawabe's response arrived in December. The report was acknowledged. No doctrinal changes would be implemented. Fighter units would continue executing standard interception procedures. Pilot morale would be maintained through emphasis on spiritual superiority rather than technical limitations. By late December 1944, B-29 raids occurred weekly: Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe. Each raid followed identical patterns. American bombers approached at 30 to 32,000 feet. Japanese fighters scrambled and struggled upward. A handful achieved firing positions. Most exhausted their fuel pursuing targets that remained tantalizingly visible but operationally unreachable. The bombers completed their missions and returned to the Marianas, having lost fewer than 2% of attacking aircraft to all causes, including mechanical failure. Japanese fighter losses approached 15% per mission, not from combat damage but from structural failures during desperate climb attempts, oxygen system malfunctions at extreme altitude, fuel exhaustion during extended pursuit, and landing accidents by pilots suffering hypothermia and oxygen deprivation. The defensive system was consuming itself attempting to counter a threat it lacked the physical capability to address. The irony was that Japanese technical intelligence had predicted this exact scenario 2 years earlier. In early 1943, intelligence officers analyzed captured documents from a crashed B-29 prototype in China. The specifications seemed impossible: pressurized crew compartments, allowing extended operations at altitudes where unpressurized aircraft could not function; remote-controlled gun turrets providing defensive coverage that required no exposure to exterior conditions; engines producing sustained power above 30,000 feet through supercharging systems Japanese industry could not replicate; range exceeding 5,000 miles with full bomb load. The initial intelligence assessment had dismissed the specifications as American propaganda. No aircraft could achieve those performance parameters within weight and cost constraints rational military planning would accept. The Americans were clearly exaggerating capabilities to influence Japanese strategic planning. Actual combat performance would inevitably fall short of propaganda claims. That assessment had been filed in March 1943. 19 months later, B-29s were bombing Tokyo exactly as those dismissed specifications predicted. The ceiling problem, Japanese intelligence had called impossible, was destroying Japanese cities night after night, while fighter units watched helplessly from altitudes 3,000 feet below American cruising levels. The realization transformed operational planning throughout the defensive structure. If interception at cruise altitude was effectively impossible, defensive doctrine had to shift toward alternative approaches. Night fighting offered possibilities since B-29s conducting night raids typically flew lower to improve bombing accuracy. Ramming tactics, always controversial, gained advocates among pilots who saw no alternative to stopping bombers that conventional gunnery could not destroy. Most significantly, some commanders began quietly acknowledging that air defense alone could not prevent American strategic bombing, and that Japan's survival required capabilities the Homeland Defense System simply did not possess. Major General Masakazu Kawabe assumed command of the newly formed Air General Army on April 15, 1945. The organization united Army and Navy fighter units under single command for the first time, ending the catastrophic coordination failures that had plagued defensive operations since November. But unifying command structures could not alter the physics that governed high-altitude combat. B-29s still cruised at 31,000 feet. Japanese fighters still struggled to reach 28,000. The altitude gap remained absolute. Kawabe's first strategic assessment acknowledged reality that previous commanders had refused to address. The B-29 threat could not be defeated through conventional interception. Altitude superiority gave American bombers an operational advantage that Japanese fighters lacked the performance margin to overcome. Defensive success required either developing new aircraft capable of sustained combat above 30,000 feet or accepting that homeland defense would fail and preparing for the invasion everyone knew was coming. Aircraft development would require minimum 12 months, assuming unlimited resources and no further disruption from American bombing. Japan had neither time nor resources nor freedom from bombing disruption. The ceiling problem that had seemed theoretical in early 1944 had become the concrete reality, destroying Japanese war-making capability in early 1945. The desperation driving Japanese aviation development by early 1945 manifested in projects that revealed how completely the altitude problem had paralyzed defensive planning. Nakajima's Ki-87 high-altitude interceptor represented Japan's most ambitious attempt to create an aircraft capable of sustained combat above 30,000 feet. The design incorporated a Nakajima Ha-219 engine, producing 2,400 horsepower through an exhaust-driven turbocharger, the same technology that gave B-29 engines their altitude performance. The first Ki-87 prototype flew in April 1945. Test pilot reports confirmed that the aircraft achieved 42,000 feet service ceiling and maintained excellent speed at altitude. The turbocharger worked exactly as designed. The pressurized cockpit allowed pilots to operate effectively at altitudes where unpressurized aircraft condemned crews to oxygen starvation. For the first time since B-29 raids began, Japanese engineers had produced an interceptor theoretically capable of matching American bomber performance. Production was scheduled for 500 aircraft beginning in August 1945. The Nakajima Ota plant would manufacture airframes. The Musashino facility would produce engines. Coordination between plants would enable delivery of operational aircraft by October at the earliest, possibly November, if component production encountered delays. On March 9, 1945, American strategic bombing doctrine changed completely. 334 B-29s attacked Tokyo from altitudes between 5,000 and 9,000 feet, flying at night, stripped of defensive armament to carry maximum incendiary loads. The raid killed more than 80,000 civilians and destroyed 16 square miles of the city. The Nakajima Musashino engine plant, already damaged by high-altitude raids, was completely destroyed. Ki-87 production became impossible. The one completed prototype was destroyed by American fighters strafing Chofu Airfield in August. The shift to low-altitude night bombing vindicated every analysis that had warned Japanese commanders about the altitude ceiling problem. General Curtis LeMay, commanding 21st Bomber Command, had recognized what Japanese intelligence had predicted. High-altitude precision bombing was failing due to jet stream winds that scattered bombs miles from aim points. Bombing accuracy from 30,000 feet averaged less than 5% of bombs within 1,000 feet of target. The altitude that protected B-29s from Japanese fighters was preventing American bombers from achieving their strategic objectives. LeMay's solution was brilliant and ruthless. If altitude provided protection but prevented accuracy, eliminate altitude and accept the risks of low-level operations. Japanese night fighter capabilities were minimal. Radar-equipped interceptors numbered fewer than 100 aircraft nationwide. Anti-aircraft guns designed for high-altitude targets could not track low-flying bombers effectively. Most critically, Japanese air defense doctrine assumed bombers would attack from altitude. The entire defensive structure was optimized to counter threats that no longer existed. The March 9th raid revealed that the ceiling problem cut both directions. Japanese fighters that could not reach 30,000 feet performed excellently between 5,000 and 10,000 feet. The Ki-45 Toryu, essentially useless against high-altitude B-29s, was highly effective as a night fighter at medium altitude. The aircraft's top speed of 350 miles per hour at 6,000 feet gave it significant performance advantage over bombers stripped of armament and flying barely above rooftop level. But night interception required radar, searchlights, ground control coordination, and pilot training that Japan had never developed systematically. The handful of radar-equipped night fighters achieved some success. The J-1N1 Gecko, equipped with upward-firing 20mm cannon, destroyed several B-29s using tactics copied from German Schreger-Music night fighters. But approximately 90 Gecko aircraft could not defend dozens of potential targets across the Japanese home islands. American bombers could simply avoid areas where night fighters concentrated. The low-altitude raids also introduced a factor that no fighter performance could counter. Firestorms created by incendiary bombing generated thermal columns rising thousands of feet with velocities approaching 100 miles per hour. Pilots attempting to intercept bombers over burning cities encountered turbulence so violent it could flip fighters inverted or tear wings from airframes. The fires that American bombers started created their own aerial defense more effective than any fighter could provide. Lieutenant Colonel Teruhiko Kobayashi commanded the 244th Sentai, the most successful B-29 interception unit in the Japanese Air Force. His unit claimed more than 100 bomber kills between November 1944 and August 1945, using tactics developed through brutal trial and error. Kobayashi had recognized early that conventional pursuit interception could not succeed at altitude. His doctrine emphasized head-on attacks that maximized closing speed and minimized exposure to defensive fire. The mathematics were unforgiving. A Ki-61, approaching a B-29 from behind at 30,000 feet, had perhaps 15 miles per hour overtake speed. Closing from 2,000 yards to effective gun range required more than 3 minutes of exposure to defensive fire from multiple turrets. Probability of survival approached zero. Head-on attacks reversed the equation. Combined closing speed exceeded 600 miles per hour. Time of exposure reduced to approximately 7 seconds, but effective firing time was equally brief, perhaps 2 seconds before collision risk forced breakaway. Kobayashi's pilots practiced head-on gunnery until muscle memory replaced conscious thought. The technique demanded precision that psychological pressure and oxygen deprivation made nearly impossible. Approach angle had to intersect the bomber's flight path exactly. Gun convergence had to be set perfectly for the brief moment when target filled the sight. The slightest deviation meant wasted ammunition and another agonizing climb to altitude for a second attempt that fuel reserves often made impossible. Even when executed perfectly, head-on attacks faced the fundamental problem that B-29 defensive armament was designed specifically to counter that exact tactic. The bomber's forward-firing turret contained 4 50-caliber machine guns with interlocked fire control that provided concentrated firepower along the approach axis. American gunners had been trained extensively in deflection shooting against high-speed targets. The brief window when Japanese fighters were in effective firing range was exactly when American defensive guns achieved maximum effectiveness. Kobayashi's unit suffered 60% casualties between December 1944 and May 1945. Replacement pilots arrived with minimal high-altitude training and even less combat experience. The learning curve was measured in dead pilots rather than accumulated flight hours. By June, most of Kobayashi's experienced fighter leaders were dead or too injured to fly. The unit continued operations with pilots who had fewer than 50 hours in type and had never practiced high-altitude gunnery under conditions approaching combat reality. The desperation manifested in ramming tactics that formalized what desperate pilots had already been doing. If conventional gunnery could not destroy B-29s, physical collision would. The Fourth Air Regiment established dedicated ramming units in October 1944 after several pilots survived ramming attacks through extraordinary luck. Specialized tactics developed around maximizing survival probability while ensuring bomber destruction. The preferred approach targeted the bomber's tail section. Diving from above and slightly behind, the fighter aimed to sever the vertical stabilizer with its propeller, while the pilot bailed out immediately before impact. Theoretically, the maneuver destroyed the bomber's directional control while giving the fighter pilot some chance of parachute escape. In practice, closure rates at high altitude meant pilots had milliseconds to execute the breakaway. Most ramming attacks killed both bomber and fighter crews. Between October 1944 and August 1945, ramming tactics destroyed 9 B-29s and damaged another 13. 21 Japanese fighters were lost with all pilots killed. The exchange ratio was catastrophic. Japan was trading irreplaceable experienced pilots for bomber crews the Americans replaced within weeks. But the mathematics of conventional interception offered no better alternatives. Ramming at least guaranteed bomber destruction if the pilot achieved attack position. Gunnery at extreme altitude in oxygen-deprived conditions produced hit rates below 5%. The strategic calculus driving ramming tactics revealed the complete collapse of Japanese defensive planning, when preserving pilot lives meant accepting that B-29s would destroy Japanese cities unopposed. Suicide attacks became rational military decisions. The altitude ceiling problem had created conditions where trading pilots for bombers on a one-to-one basis represented acceptable defensive doctrine. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Major General Kawabe's April reorganization of air defense forces attempted to optimize resources against an impossible challenge. High-altitude interception doctrine was quietly abandoned. Fighter units received instructions to wait until American bombers descended to bombing altitude before launching attacks. The logic was brutal, but sound. If fighters could not catch bombers at cruise altitude, conserve fuel and position for attacks during the vulnerable moments when bombing runs required straight and level flight. The tactic achieved modest success. Bombing altitude typically ranged between 20,000 and 25,000 feet, altitudes where Japanese fighters performed adequately. During the brief minutes when B-29s maintained steady course for bomb release, defensive maneuvering was constrained. Fighter attacks during bomb runs increased bomber losses marginally, from approximately 1% to nearly 2% of attacking aircraft. But the strategic impact was negligible. American bomber production exceeded losses by orders of magnitude. The 21st Bomber Command could sustain 2% attrition rates indefinitely. Japanese fighter units could not sustain 15% casualties per mission for more than a few months, before experienced pilot losses made the entire force combat ineffective. The exchange ratio favored America so overwhelmingly that even successful defensive operations accelerated Japan's military collapse. The final irony was that Japanese industry had developed several high-altitude interceptor designs, theoretically capable of defeating the B-29 threat. The Kawasaki Ki 94 interceptor promised service ceiling above 48,000 feet and speed exceeding 400 miles per hour at altitude. The Mitsubishi J-8M rocket-powered interceptor could climb to 39,000 feet in under 4 minutes and carried 30mm cannon capable of destroying bombers with brief firing bursts. None achieved operational status before war's end. The Ki 94 prototype was 80% complete when American forces occupied Japan. The J-8M flew once in July 1945, but required German rocket engine technology that submarine warfare prevented from reaching Japan. The Mizuno Shinryu interceptor, designed specifically to attack B-29s at high altitude using rocket propulsion, never progressed beyond design studies. Every promising program foundered on resource limitations, production disruptions from American bombing, or technological dependencies on materials Japan could no longer import. The strategic bombing campaign had created a feedback loop where bombing disrupted the aircraft production necessary to defend against bombing. The ceiling problem prevented effective interception, which allowed unrestricted bombing, which prevented development of aircraft capable of solving the ceiling problem. Lieutenant Yoshio Yoshida flew his final mission on July 15, 1945. His Ki-84 Hayate, one of fewer than 70 operational high-altitude fighters remaining in the Home Defense Force, scrambled at 06:15 hours in response to radar tracking indicating massive American bomber formations approaching Osaka. The briefing was routine. 74 B-29s escorted by 130 P-51 Mustang fighters. Target assumed to be industrial facilities in the Osaka-Kobe corridor. Estimated time over target 0745. Yoshida's unit, the 17th Sentai, had been formed in April specifically for high-altitude interception. The pilots were among the most experienced in the remaining fighter force. The aircraft were the best Japan could still produce. The tactical doctrine represented accumulated knowledge from 8 months of failed interceptions, refined into procedures that maximized survival probability while offering marginal chance of actually destroying bombers. The mission proceeded exactly as training predicted. Yoshida climbed to 28,000 feet over Osaka Bay, positioning for intercept as American formations approached from the south. Oxygen flow was adequate. Engine performance remained within acceptable parameters. Fuel consumption matched pre-flight calculations. He achieved position ahead of the bomber stream with sufficient altitude advantage for a diving attack. Then he saw them. Not 74 bombers, 472 B-29s, the largest daylight raid in the Pacific War. The formations stretched across the sky in combat boxes that extended beyond visual range. The mathematical absurdity was instant and overwhelming. 17 Sentai had managed to launch 11 fighters, 11 aircraft against 472 bombers, protected by escorts that outnumbered Japanese fighters 12-1. Yoshida selected a target, rolled into his attack dive, and watched his closing speed indicator climb toward 400 miles per hour. The B-29 grew larger in his sight. Defensive tracers arced past his canopy. He pressed the firing button and felt his 30mm cannon recoil through the airframe. 3 seconds of firing before the closure rate forced him to break away. He thought he saw impacts on the bomber's wing but could not confirm as he pulled 8G recovering from the dive. His wingman was gone, shot down by escorts or defensive fire, Yoshida never knew which. He climbed again, searching for another attack opportunity, watching his fuel gauge drop below minimum recovery reserve. The bomber formations proceeded to their targets, dropped their ordnance, and began their return flight. Yoshida turned for base, nursing his fuel, knowing that 11 fighters had achieved nothing against a raid that would destroy what remained of Osaka's industrial capacity. Post-mission intelligence estimated the 17th Sentai had damaged 3 B-29s, no confirmed kills. 1 Japanese fighter lost. Osaka burned for 3 days. Industrial output from the Osaka-Kobe region, already reduced 60% by previous raids, effectively ceased. The mathematics of strategic bombing had reached their logical conclusion. American bomber production and operational capacity had scaled beyond any defensive response Japan could mount. The altitude ceiling problem that had seemed like temporary technical limitation in November 1944 had become the mechanism of national defeat by July 1945. The final statistical analysis, compiled by Imperial General Headquarters in early August, documented the complete failure of defensive operations with numerical precision. Between November 1944 and August 1945, American B-29s had flown approximately 34,000 sorties against Japanese targets. Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft defenses had destroyed approximately 414 bombers total, representing a loss rate of 1.2%. Of those losses, 80 were attributed to fighter interception. 80 bombers destroyed by the complete Japanese fighter force across 9 months of maximum defensive effort. American bomber production during that same period exceeded 3,900 aircraft. The 21st Bomber Command replaced losses within days and expanded operational strength continuously. By August, more than 1,000 B-29s were operational in the Marianas, with additional hundreds in training or transit. Japan's fighter force had contracted from approximately 4,500 aircraft in November 1944 to fewer than 1,000 operational fighters by August 1945. Pilot quality had collapsed, as experienced aircrews died faster than training programs could replace them with even minimally qualified pilots. The ceiling problem that Japanese intelligence had dismissed as American propaganda in early 1943 had become the single most decisive technical advantage of the Pacific War's final phase. The B-29's ability to operate above 30,000 feet had rendered Japan's entire defensive fighter force strategically irrelevant. The handful of aircraft capable of reaching bombers at cruise altitude lacked the performance margin to engage effectively. The shift to low-altitude night bombing had neutralized even that marginal capability. By exploiting different vulnerabilities, Japanese defenses were equally unprepared to address. General Kawabe's final assessment, submitted to the Supreme War Council on August 10, 1945, acknowledged what had been obvious since December. Air defense of the homeland had failed completely. American strategic bombing had destroyed Japan's industrial capacity, transportation infrastructure, and civilian morale. The defensive system had consumed irreplaceable pilots and aircraft, achieving negligible results against a threat it lacked the fundamental capabilities to counter. Continuation of defensive operations represented waste of resources needed for the final battle everyone knew was coming. The assessment was filed on August 10th. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. The defensive war that the altitude ceiling problem had made impossible was over. The B-29s had won. The technical post-war analysis conducted by American intelligence officers revealed details that Japanese commanders had suspected but could never confirm. The B-29 had been designed from the beginning to operate beyond the performance envelope of existing fighter aircraft. Boeing engineers had calculated precisely how altitude degraded fighter engine performance, pilot effectiveness, and weapons accuracy. The entire aircraft existed to exploit those degradations systematically. The pressurized cabin maintained sea-level atmospheric pressure at 31,000 feet altitude, allowing crews to operate without oxygen masks or exposure suits. Japanese pilots attacking at that altitude were suffering oxygen starvation. that reduced mental acuity by 30%, slowed reaction times significantly, and created tunnel vision that made target tracking nearly impossible. The Americans fought in shirt sleeves while Japanese pilots froze and suffocated. The R-3350 engines incorporated two-stage superchargers that maintained rated horsepower to 30,000 feet. Japanese engines lost 40% power at that altitude, degrading speed, climb rate, and maneuverability proportionally. American bombers cruised at speeds that represented maximum performance for Japanese interceptors, creating the impossible chase geometry that had frustrated defensive operations throughout the campaign. Most critically, the remote-controlled gun turrets provided defensive coverage that required no crew exposure to exterior conditions. Japanese fighters attacking B-29s faced gunners operating from pressurized compartments with computing sites that automatically calculated deflection and range. The technology represented 10 years of development and millions of dollars of investment that Japanese aviation industry could not have replicated regardless of time or resources available. The ceiling problem had never been merely about altitude performance. It represented a comprehensive systems mismatch where every aspect of American bomber design exploited corresponding Japanese weakness. Engine power versus thin air oxygen deprivation, pressurization versus exposure, computing sites versus manual gunnery, American industrial capacity versus Japanese resource limitations. Major Kashide survived the war and testified extensively during Allied intelligence debriefings. His account emphasized the psychological devastation of pursuing targets that remained perpetually beyond reach. Fighter pilots who had dominated Pacific combat found themselves reduced to spectators watching their homeland burn from altitudes they could not sustain. The crushing awareness that technical limitations made victory impossible regardless of pilot courage or tactical skill had destroyed morale more effectively than any combat defeat. Kashide's testimony focused particularly on the missed opportunities that might have altered outcomes. If Japanese intelligence had taken B-29 specifications seriously in early 1943 instead of dismissing them as propaganda, if aircraft development had prioritized high-altitude performance over dogfighting capability, if resources had concentrated on producing fewer high-performance interceptors rather than dispersing production across multiple mediocre designs, if commanders had acknowledged the ceiling problem honestly instead of demanding impossible achievements through spiritual superiority, every if led to the same conclusion. Japan lacked the industrial capacity, technological foundation, and resource access to compete with American aviation development. The ceiling problem was symptomatic of broader systemic weaknesses that strategic bombing had exploited ruthlessly. The B-29 had not simply flown above Japanese fighters. It had demonstrated that modern warfare belonged to nations with industrial capacity to produce systems too sophisticated for less developed economies to counter. The final irony Kashide emphasized was that Japanese engineers had understood the problem completely. The technical analyses were thorough and accurate. The recommendations were sound. The resource requirements were calculated precisely. What Japan lacked was not technical knowledge, but the industrial ecosystem necessary to implement solutions within timelines that mattered strategically. Knowing how to build high-altitude interceptors meant nothing when aluminum was unavailable. Precision tooling was destroyed by bombing, and experienced workers were dead or drafted. The B-29's operational ceiling had been unreachable, not because Japanese aircraft could not climb high enough, but because the entire technological and industrial infrastructure necessary to compete at those altitudes did not exist in Japan. The ceiling problem was material reality, defeating military necessity through physics that rhetoric could not overcome. The Boeing Superfortresses that had remained untouchable above 30,000 feet were scrapped by the thousands in the late 1940s as newer bombers made them obsolete. The Japanese fighters that had struggled vainly to reach them were destroyed as wartime relics. The altitude gap that had decided the Pacific War's outcome became historical curiosity, a technical footnote in the larger narrative of American industrial supremacy and Japanese defeat. But for the pilots who had flown those impossible missions, climbing until oxygen starvation blurred vision and hypothermia numbed hands, pursuing bombers that cruised effortlessly beyond reach, The ceiling problem remained the defining memory of defeat, not the catastrophic losses, not the burning cities, not even the atomic bombs, but the simple, absolute reality of watching destruction approach from altitudes where physics itself prevented response. The ceiling had been unreachable, and that had been enough. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.